The Senan district proved attractive because irrigation networks provided hydroelectric power, a steady supply of skilled textile labor already existed in the area, waste cotton was readily available from other textile industries, and asbestos imports that arrived at docks at Sakai could be delivered to the district relatively quickly. In 1965, with the Senan district leading the way, Osaka, the city, boasted 22% of Japan's asbestos workers and 36% of asbestos businesses. In the Senan district, however, officials witnessed early signs of the health problems related to occupational exposure to asbestos. In 1937 to 1940, a study conducted by the Home Ministry determined that pulmonary disease had reached dangerous levels. Conducted by Dr. Sukegawa Hiroshi, the study examined 650 workers at 14 manufacturing facilities, right, and determined that 12% had developed asbestosis. The longer workers served in the industry, moreover, the greater their propensity was for developing serious pulmonary disease. This was the most comprehensive study of its type to date that at least I've been able to find, predating similar studies conducted in the UK by Edward Merriweather and Charles Price, and well before the New York studies by Irving Selkoff, mentioned earlier in the presentation. After the Pacific War, similar studies demonstrated the prevalence of asbestosis in Senan workers. In 1956 through 1957, for example, another study undertaken by the Labor Ministry determined that a full 16% of workers in the area had signs of serious pulmonary disease caused by asbestos. Nonetheless, asbestos marched on. After the Pacific War, asbestos played a key role in Japan's reconstruction. Not only was asbestos used extensively in Japan's built environment, but it also played a key role in several critical post-war industries, including ammonia sulfide production for fertilizers and plastics. As one bureaucrat in the post-war Economic Stabilization Agency commented, quote, "With each advance made by modern civilization, asbestos has gained value as a key material resource, and demand for asbestos has grown dramatically in the post-war era, particularly with the drive to rebuild our war-ravaged nation." End of quote. He continued, "The trend now is toward ever more powerful machinery and devices of every kind that place their components under the strains of high pressure and temperatures. The asbestos industry has a great future ahead." End of quote. Now, the government earmarked an enormous amount of asbestos for fabricating membranes for the production of ammonia sulfide. In 1946, electrolytic membranes required some 1.2 million pounds of asbestos, while joint sheeting, the next most prominent asbestos product, required about 284,000 pounds. But asbestos was everywhere in Japan's post-war recovery. In the 1960s, thousands of metric tons of asbestos was used in asbestos yarns and fabrics, joint sheeting, slate, paper, brake linings, lumber, insulation, and a variety of other very common building materials. But as it became apparent that asbestos caused pulmonary disease, the government began to take steps to mitigate the health consequences. In 1960, for example, the government passed the pneumoconiosis law. In 1971, the government passed the Prevention of Hazards Due to Specific Chemical Substances law, which mandated that industries handling asbestos install adequate ventilation systems and monitor air quality. Spray-on products with less than 5% asbestos were not banned under the ordinances, but many other asbestos products actually were. In 1975, the government revised the Chemical Substance Ordinance, which treated asbestos as a carcinogen. In 1989, the government revised the Air Pollution Control Law, which regulated dust densities at facilities working with asbestos. Incrementally, that is to say, the government began taking steps to tighten control over the dangerous fiber. But as I mentioned earlier, it was the quota shock of 2005 that galvanized public opinion against asbestos. Between 1957 and 1975, Kubota Corporation used some 90,000 metric tons of dangerous blue asbestos from South Africa in the production of its cement pipes. Of the 251 workers involved in the production of the pipes for a period of a decade or more, 120 had become sick and 61 had died as a result of asbestos exposure. In a public statement released in March of 2010, Kubota acknowledged that 144 former employees had died from the disease caused by prolonged asbestos exposure. Subsequent studies demonstrated that asbestos released into the surrounding neighborhoods had also caused widespread asbestosis and mesothelioma, with unnerving and very interesting gender dynamics. As a result, in 2006, the government passed the Act on Asbestos Health Damage Relief, which created a safety net for people that had become sickened by asbestos exposure. And just very quickly on the Kubota shock. So the Kanzaki factory was doing something very interesting. They specialized in making cement pipes. And the cement pipes used raw asbestos fibers in there as a kind of reinforcement. So this is what they specialize in doing. I first met a Japanese epidemiologist that was working on this particular case about 10 years ago when I was contacted by a Japanese delegation that was going to Libby, Montana to see how the Superfund cleanup site was being run by the federal government in Libby. So I got to know, his name was Dr. Kurumatani, and he was one of the sort of the people that broke the story on the Kubota shock. And basically what happened at Kubota is one of these interesting unintended consequence stories. But Kubota Corporation actually took a lot of steps to try to protect their workers once it became clear that they were being poisoned by the asbestos. So a lot of the workers in the plant had good respirators. A lot of them, the plant was very sufficiently ventilated. The problem is that they ventilated the plant right into the surrounding neighborhoods. So the reason I said that it had these unintended gender consequences was it was housewives that, because of gender expectations for women in Japan at the time, were staying home making bento lunches for their children, and they were actually being poisoned because of the ventilation system that was at the Kanzaki plant. And so here you see what these cement pipes look like. If you talk to anybody within Japan, lawyers or toxic people that study environmental toxicology, they would tell you that this is what worries them the most. Because cities with these massive infrastructures in the post-war years was built, the water systems were built with this kind of cement piping that has asbestos in it. And anybody that knows a lot about the kind of toxicology of asbestos would tell you that the new generation of illnesses are not all respiratory diseases. It's colon cancer, gastrointestinal cancers of a variety of varieties, because the asbestos fibers, just as they can get lodged in your pulmonary system, they can also get lodged in your GI system. So as all this pipe decays, right, which is the infrastructure for much of the public water system in Japan, there's growing concerns about what the public health consequences are going to be in the future. But none of these measures could inoculate Japanese from the threat of asbestos released during natural disasters. Despite Japan's best efforts to control asbestos exposure through policy and legislation, the uncontrolled release of asbestos undermined many of those efforts. The story of asbestos in Japan is no longer about asbestos in construction, which all of these laws sought to regulate, but rather about asbestos in destruction, which obeys no laws. So in its examination of natural disasters in the United States, environmental historian Ted Steinberg argues that not only do so-called natural disasters bear overwhelming human-made components, but that politicians and planners, quote, view these events as purely natural in an effort to justify a set of responses that has proved both environmentally unsound and socially, if not morally, bankrupt. Certainly, this explains the Japanese government's response to the Great Eastern Japan earthquake, where the unpredictable, unnatural, unforeseeable aspects of the calamity, that it was a 1,000-year disaster, were used to justify not only government ineptitude, particularly with regards to oversight of the nuclear power industry, but also legitimize further expansion of nuclear power within Japan. Quote, Seen as freak events cut off from people's everyday interactions with the environment, writes Steinberg, natural disasters are positioned outside the moral compass of our culture. As Steinberg insists, however, natural disasters do not just happen. Rather, quote, they are produced through a chain of human choices and natural occurrences, and in this sense they form a legitimate topic for social and historical study. In this sense, natural disasters are not disinterested, morally inert catastrophes. Rather, they are actually historical constructions. Now, I will not rehearse with this audience in particular the geologic and seismological particularities of the March 11, 2011 earthquake and tsunami in northeastern Japan. You're all quite aware of it, and we are now very close to the 5th year anniversary of this event. Suffice it to say that all these geologic and seismic factors contributed to the natural capacity of the great Eastern Japan earthquake to kill, damage property, and disrupt lives. Now, other than traces of sea level increases, which exacerbated the effects of the waves, right, the earthquake and tsunami originated beyond the hands of humans. They were actually naturally occurring. But once the waves of shaking earth and the wall of water reached the eastern shore of Japan, the natural disaster immediately transformed into a human-made one, destroying or washing away economic development schemes, class divisions, seawalls, retail stores, public schools, subsidized fishing ports, greenhouses, and other material relics of Japanese policies and Japanese decision-making. As it turned out, the earthquake and tsunami were only the beginning of Japan's 3/11 nightmare. 3 nuclear reactors melted down at the Fukushima Daiichi complex run by Tokyo Electric Power Company and saturated nearby communities in dangerous levels of radiation, rendering many of them uninhabitable for perhaps generations. Most of the 110,000 people that the government evacuated from the area saturated in radiation own homes that would sicken them if they ever moved back. The radioactive material is turned up everywhere, in water supplies, daycare centers, breast milk, baby formula, lake's milk, beef, green tea. Fukushima radiation has permeated Japan's food chain, and government officials have detected radiation in every Japanese prefecture, including Okinawa. Some half of the children in Fukushima have internal radiation poisoning, threatening serious health problems in the future, including dangerous cancer.